everyone. I think we'll get started. Thank you so much for joining us at a live in-person event, and thank you so much for those of you who are joining us from home for the online part of the event. It's excellent to be doing something hybrid like this, and we're really excited to be here in this really beautiful space. So yeah, thanks very much. This event is part of the Dear Green Bothy, a programme from the College of Arts at the University of Glasgow, and we're hosting creative and critical responses to the climate emergency. We're also delighted to be co-hosting tonight with the university's Centre for Fantasy and the Fantastic. And if you're tweeting along with tonight's discussion, make sure to use the following hashtags: hashtag the Dear Green Bothy and hashtag ecofantasy. So, as you know, we're delighted to welcome to Glasgow tonight Kim Stanley Robinson, renowned science fiction author. Kim Stanley Robinson is a New York Times bestseller and winner of the Hugo, Nebula and Locus awards. He's the author of more than 20 books, including the best-selling Mars trilogy, 2312, Aurora and New York 2140. In 2008, he was named a Hero of the Environment by Time, and he works with the Sierra Nevada Research Institute, and he lives in Davis, California. So we can do this in person now. Let's give Kim Stanley Robinson a round of applause to welcome him. That's a good sign. So could we just start off, would you like to tell us a bit about the new novel, Ministry for the Future?
Sure. And it's why I'm here, in that I have been asked to speak at COP26, and I would say that that is really the result of this book in particular, filling a kind of hunger people feel for a story of the near future that presents as somewhat of a best case scenario, the mass extinction event that we are trembling on the brink of avoided, but in a way that you could still believe in, at least whilst reading, in a kind of state of Coleridgean willed suspension of disbelief. And so while in that beautiful state, the generosity of the reader reading a novel, which is a state I know very well, being a reader first and a writer second, this book is that story. It covers, I designed it and wrote it to describe the next 3 decades, while obscuring the dates in it, which is a lucky thing because the dates are now all wrong, all been thrown off already, badly so, to the point where I'm quite shocked. But the point is, when you're writing near future science fiction, you ought not to put dates on it anyway, so that you can put it into an imaginative space of the day after tomorrow or whatever. Nevertheless, by the lifetime of the Minister for the Future herself, Mary Murphy, Irish diplomat, you can tell that she's lives a few decades through this book. So that was my self-imposed task. And as I say, I wrote it in 2019. I think it's important to say that. A previous geological epoch, a long time ago, 2019. Things were different then. It was before the pandemic, and we still had our President Trump. It was a dark time. And I wrote the book in a state of kind of fierce or desperate hope that it could come out okay, and tried to imagine how that might happen. And so the ministry of the title is a UN organization. Ultimately, the Paris Agreement, which I regard as an important event in world history, if we make it so. In the agreement itself, which is a very interesting document, by the way, 16 or 18 pages, is written in a relatively clear prose. It's not legalistic, it's diplomatic. There's a difference. You can understand it, and every phrase has been hammered out. And there are important phrases about climate equity that people have given the bulk of their careers to injecting into that document. Very important. Well, they gave themselves the right to set up standing subcommittees as needed. And so for the purposes of this book, I have them setting up a standing subcommittee to deal with problems that aren't being dealt with properly in the between these COP meetings. And so I learned a lot about the Paris Agreement. I had some lucky encounters with people who knew a lot more than I did. This happens a lot, and it's a sign that maybe a book has got a lucky star over it. And now, I mean, a UN subcommittee as the salvation of the world, it's a weak reed to put your hopes onto, but we've got a global planetary biosphere emergency, and we live in a nation state system with a political economy that you can call neoliberal capitalism still, maybe. There again, the pandemic has been a knock, a slap to the face, maybe the start of a change. But in any case, the systems that we have are awkward fit to the emergency that we face. In fact, you could say that the systems that we have are precisely the problem that have created the biospheric emergency. So how immediately you are faced with a horrible problem. How do you solve a biosphere crash using the same systems that created the conditions in the first place? So it was like cobbling together some kind of horrid scaffolding to a solution and tell the story, as Emerson advised, skate fast over thin ice. And I thought the novel is a capacious form. I have a lot of faith in the novel as a form. It's the genre that isn't a genre. It's the form without a form. It's simply novel. It's new. It's not a poetry. It's not play. It's a long prose narrative with a problem. I think that's the famous definition of the novel. And in this case, I decided it would have a central strand of the minister herself and her an acquaintance of hers, and a couple of her colleagues, and then eyewitness accounts. And I will wrap up this answer just by saying that crucially for this text, there are 106 chapters. There's probably 30 or 40 different literary forms. Well, maybe 15 or 20 literary forms represented. When you read it and you come to a new chapter, you don't know what kind of text you're going to be reading. The first paragraph will tell you, but it's a kind of game to play. But for me, the critical discovery was the eyewitness account, which is not fiction, nor is it written like fiction. It's an untheorized genre of its own, the eyewitness account. We have anthologies of them. Spring 1945, it's a famous German anthology. That woman from Belarus, who I believe won the Nobel Prize collecting stories from the Soviet Union. The eyewitness account, there's lots of them. I began to collect them, and they have their own rules. Someone has seen something and either witnessed it or taken part in something later declared to be historically important. And they are not going to tell you what they had for breakfast that morning or any of the other markers that you're now reading a novel. And they're also looking back at it. So they are judging it. They're making judgments as to what it meant to them and to the world. There were maybe 30 or 40 eyewitness accounts in this novel. And of course I made them up. But on the other hand, this is where it's a lovely thing to be a novelist. I was channeling the voices come out of our culture, doing pastiche of the different voices. And at this point in my career, I can, in fact, alter my style a little bit to fit the speakers. It's kind of like doing dialogue. And don't often work in first person, but of course, eyewitness accounts are necessarily so. The response to those voices. So I feel like a choreographer or a reporter. In the world. And despite the dark weirdness of 2019, I had about 4 or 6 months of just a glorious feeling of channeling.
Mm-hmm.
So I would regard that as, for me, the extraordinary part of this book, which in many ways is just a big mess. But it was fun mess to write.
And it absolutely doesn't read like a big mess. It all comes together. It's interesting that you say that about the novel being the genre without a genre. So, you know, there's been a lot of discussion about whether science fiction is better or maybe, yeah, better suited to deal with the climate crisis than realistic novels. So like you said, we don't necessarily need novels about what people had for breakfast. We need things that can deal with spectacular events. You know, some people might be familiar with Amitav Ghosh's writing The Great Derangement, and he doesn't seem to have that much faith in science fiction even still. But would you agree with that science fiction is particularly well suited to dealing with these issues? Or, because as you say, these eyewitness accounts, they could be from contemporary times. They don't have to be from the future, you know.
Sure. No, I am a science fiction patriot. I have defined myself as a science fiction writer for almost 50 years. And I did that on purpose because of my Southern California youth, where the radical transformation of an agricultural community to a big city in a period of 10 years. Although I was too young to notice it at the time, after the fact, I realized I had been through something extraordinary and that science fiction was the way to speak of it. So I am a patriot, and I believe that science fiction, by setting a story in the future, by using the various tropes of the genre, but principally setting the story in the future, that implies a history that gets us from here to there, which implies a theory of history. And the individual characters, and I would agree that fiction depends crucially on its characters. We want to be experiencing that telepathic connection of what someone else is thinking, a rare or even impossible occurrence. That when you're reading a novel, that's why you're loving the reading of the novel. You are experiencing the thoughts of the other. Well, that's powerful, but what science fiction does is the ordinary novel. Well, I don't want to get too deep into the weeds here. In the 19th century, it was very common to have your characters involved with their society and with the processes of history itself. So the novels of Balzac or George Eliot, these are benchmark novels of what the novel could do. But in the modernist period, it became the individual consciousness contemplating itself. Not entirely, but it was a trend that after the World War II, the great modernists had their work reified, partly by English departments, into a thing of the only good novel was a modernist novel. And then a narrator that was speaking about history, someone doing summary rather than dramatization, it all began to look suspect. And the novel was narrowed down to the individual bourgeois subject and their individual problems. Well, it always could be more than that. It was before. And science fiction, by being about the future, is the relationship between the characters and their society, which is often estranged and in a Brechtian way. It looks like it's a different culture, and then you realize that it's a way of thinking of our culture. And then also the planet. This is the great power of science fiction, is right from the start. It was the planetary romance. Let's go off to Mars, or let's go off to the other side of the universe. And the planetary romance is a quite beautiful subgenre of science fiction where you finesse the problems of getting there, etc. But to contemplate a planet itself that's different, and the romance of that is intense. So it's the right genre for our time. It's the right genre for the climate crisis. And Amitav Ghosh is a fine novelist. The Glass Palace is a beautiful novel of the national history of Burma. But I can speak personally myself. There's many a good novelist that is not particularly great at theory. And yet they publish their essays anyway. And you look at these collections of essays, and sometimes you end up rolling your eyes, and you even think, well, how could a person that well, what ordinary? How could such a great novel have come out of that ordinary person? But of course, all these novels come out of ordinary people, and so the best thing is not to publish your nonfiction, not to publish books of this. And so Ghosh, a great novelist, he's totally wrong. His attitude towards science fiction is actually a form of Proustian snobbery, which you would think he would know better than to inflict on the culture and on the poor toilers in this science fiction outhouse, as he called it. That literary fiction of our time is the mansion, and then the genres, mysteries, detective stories, science fiction are in the outhouse. Well, in America, the outhouse is actually the toilet outside. I was rather appalled and insulted when I realized he meant the outbuildings, like in a big mansion with. Did he though? Well, I don't know, but I'm giving him the benefit of the doubt that he meant that like maybe I'm the caretaker's cottage. Well, that's fine by me, but in any case, he's got it completely backwards. The large house of literature includes the fantastic, goes back to Homer, it goes back into the Paleolithic. The domestic realism of the Jane Austen, George Eliot modernism tradition is a subset of a much larger literary universe. And so he's got it exactly backwards. And why he would be so snobbish when he has his own personal histories and relationship to England, I have no idea. But I'm still irritated with him, as you can tell.
I'll say fair play to him. He started a conversation at least, so you know the rest.
I'd love to talk to him sometime because I certainly have enjoyed his novels.
I think that's really interesting what you're saying about like the relationship between character and world in science fiction as well, because I think there's something that you're dealing with in this novel that I was really fascinated with, which is, so one of the main characters, Frank, he's been in a situation where he's witnessed one of these, I think you call it a wet bulb temperature of 35, which is when healthy human beings will die. And he's been in a situation where he's seen basically a town of people in India all succumb to this terrible heat with no help. He's the only one that survives, and he suffers from PTSD, as you describe it. But there's something really, there was some way that you discussed PTSD that I wondered if you could talk about. Do you think that society kind of psychologizes things too much? Because there's almost a sense there, I think, that this is what they're describing it as. They're saying that he has PTSD, but almost I feel like there's a way that you're getting at that he's having a sensible reaction to an incredible situation, and that almost to call it PTSD is to reduce it to something that doesn't capture the macro level of what's been going on there. Maybe that's just me reading into it, but I thought there was something there between character and world, as you say.
That's very interesting. I'm going to think on my feet here, and that's always scary for me. Yeah, the PTSD is a psychologizing response. We need those, they're useful. We're in a social world. These categories, these new affectual disorders that we have given ourselves now are symptomatic of the new moment of history, the new structure of feeling that we're in. PTSD, also on the spectrum. These are new and necessary attempts to try to comprehend our social reality with each other. So I'm not adverse to that at all, but what you're saying here, I think that is interesting is that to talk of PTSD as the individual and response, the individual human response, but there's a world response that is the mass extinction event or biosphere collapse. And that is not adequately described by the term PTSD. But let's go back to that because I am interested in it, and it has a little Glasgow story, if I hope I can tell it. We're all post-traumatic. If you're human, you live long enough, something's going to happen, and you are post-it afterwards. Everybody can probably call up what their own personal example of it is. So the question then becomes, what about the stress disorder? A lot of people take on these burdens of their life. It's part of being human, and you carry on. Some people can't cope. They're stuck in a loop. of shock and grief, and that's PTSD, and they definitely need therapy. And my character Frank is a classic sufferer of PTSD. Of course, I read about it, and I am, like all the rest of us here, post-traumatic myself, and can very easily imagine the stress disorder, which I believe I've successfully evaded. But you have to work at it, given the world that we're in. So to me, it was really interesting. And in terms of making sure that as a novel, that it's grounded in characters, and that one of them has this problem to deal with, means that I still have characters in this novel that is somehow a world novel or a science fiction novel. So I got very interested in that. And I guess I can briefly venture that the most shocking or spectacular trauma of my life happened about a couple of weeks before I had to make a book tour of England that almost got canceled. It was almost the worst time possible. If it had been a little bit closer, we would have canceled, and yet it was still too close, and here I was. And well, it was a crowd in Glasgow that was of huge solace. Very warm crowd at a bookstore at Waterstones down by the river. So that's why that scene is in the book. So, and I was thinking to myself at the time, do they know what I've gone through or not? And then I realized it didn't matter. Either way, there was the warmth. So if they didn't know, they're just being hospitable to a visiting writer. If they did know, they were trying to help out.
That's beautiful. I was going to ask you about the Glasgow. I just thought it was because Frank comes to Glasgow to recuperate from his stress, and he walks through the city, and I just thought it was funny that Glasgow is like the emblem of a cold city to go to. You know, no. He's going to go and get rained on for a while to cheer himself up.
I picked it specifically for that incident. I needed to memorialize that somehow. One does that a lot, of course. You know, the personal in there. Very often science fiction and novel writing in general, you're just a conduit for other people's stories. So occasionally you have, and especially when that takes place all over the world, you have to find some places where you can bring it home to stuff you really know.
Well, that leads me on to something else I was going to ask about. A lot of the novels set in Switzerland, and I believe you lived there for a while, but I wanted to ask you, did you set it there primarily because you lived there and you loved the place? Because you certainly seem like you love it in the novel. Or was there something about Switzerland and its political economic situation that you felt was a particularly good base for thinking about climate change and how to attack that?
That's also a good question. I chose it because, you know, it's a UN agency. They're usually in Geneva, but Geneva is crowded and expensive precisely because of the UN. And Zurich and Geneva are like Glasgow and Edinburgh, or Los Angeles and San Francisco. Although actually it's Zurich and Basel that have the true rivalry. I mean, Geneva's over in France, and you know, Switzerland splits up by its linguistic groups. So the Swiss Romand is a different realm than the German Swiss, der Schweiz. So, but I love Zurich. My wife and I had 2 years there when we were young, before we had kids. It was glorious. The first time I was a full-time writer. I was living right under the grave with the beautiful statue of James Joyce. I was talking with John about that earlier. It was beautiful, and it went like that. I mean, 2 years afterwards, it looks like nothing. But while we were there, it was a whole world. And the Swiss were strange. And what we didn't like about them, we knew in 2 years we'd be gone. And the stuff we did like was very likable. And so you've got the Red Cross, but you've also got the Nazi gold. I mean, they're as conflicted and bizarre as any nation on earth. But they also have 4 language groups that cooperate and get along. And they took on and publicized that Romansh was one of the 4 official languages of Switzerland. They're very proud of this, precisely during the 30s, to resist Hitler and Austria's racism. And, you know, they had to make accommodations. There was not only the Nazi gold, but also this strange neutrality where they had to let the Germans and Italians cross their country on trains, but they also were ready to blow up their whole country if they got invaded, which is why they were never invaded. They publicized to the Germans that they had mined every single bridge and road in the country. True for the Soviets as well. So they're so strange and interesting. They're like, but not like. And they're also capitalist, but some kind of peculiar version of social democrats. They're in and out of the world. They were very useful for this, to present a kind of a peculiar third angle on things that is neither, there's like nothing else. Maybe that means that they're not particularly applicable, like this, if there's a Swiss solution, it's not available to the rest of us. But I wanted to put it there anyway. It's 35 years later, I still hadn't written a word about Switzerland, and I had a lot of feelings that I wanted to put in. And again, you have to have a local habitation and a name. A novel that's bouncing around the world, and science fiction always has cardboard sets. You know, the spaceship is always a cardboard set, like in Star Trek. So to ground it and to bring it home to a city that I quite loved, and a time in our life when we quite loved, it's made a bit of a splash in Zurich itself. And now it's in German, and soon will be in French. And not that they really need that, but it's nice.
Is it going to be in Swiss German?
No, they don't write Swiss German down.
Okay.
It's a joke. Whenever things are written in Swiss German, like they have a U with an umlaut over it, where you would have one, and they want to imply to you that this is Swiss German on the page, they'll put like 5 U's with umlauts in a row.
That's how you write.
So you don't write it. You don't write down Swiss German.
Okay, there's an ignorant question for you. So let's talk about, because it is a science fiction novel, let's talk about the technologies that you employ in the novel, because that would be exciting to hear about. What technologies do you have that can avert climate change, and how realistic are they, and are they being used already, or are they completely imaginary? Because we hope they're real.
No, they're real. But let's go right to the main one, financial technology. Because all of the mechanical tech is a known quantity. We've invented it. It's there to be deployed, but we don't have a way to pay for it. So this phrase out of Silicon Valley or out of capitalism, does it scale? They don't mean, is there enough metal and enough workers to build this stuff fast? The answer to that is always yes. When they say, does it scale, they mean, can we do it fast and still make a profit from it? So it's interesting to interrogate the language of capitalism, the various words, innovate, entrepreneur, does it scale? These are suspect, loaded words that need to be torn to shreds and analyzed for their ideological substructures that are enforcing capitalist realism, which, as I said this afternoon, is an extremely useful new phrase to capture another part of our structure of feeling. Capitalist realism, there is no alternative, blah, blah. Well, there is, and there needs to be. So the financial technology in the book, the carbon coin, is the crucial innovation. Can we pay ourselves, which means put ourselves to work, to do the good things, rather than paying ourselves to extract, expropriate, and destroy. And so following strands of certain technical papers and the instructions of some friends, I came to the carbon coin, which is just a name. People sometimes don't like that name, but in any case, you say you sequester or draw down a ton of carbon, you get paid 1 carbon coin for it. And by that means, along with carbon quantitative easing, which is a variant on it, which is just a kind of Keynesian moment where the governments create new fiat money, as we did in 2008 in the quantitative easing, as we did last year in 2020 when the pandemic hit, to save the economy. New fiat money, trillions worth. This is how weird our system is. I've heard estimates between $5 and $15 trillion made up after 2008 to keep the economy liquid and recover from the real estate speculative bubble crash. And after the pandemic, I don't believe anybody's even accounted how much new money was created by legislatures to keep the economy going. you need to do it again on an annual basis and hope that it won't destroy people's faith in money, which is usually registered by inflation or deflation. And that money needs to be not given to the banks to do their usual stupid stuff, the private banks, but actually be spent directly on decarbonization efforts. So it's a version of the carbon coin. And by that expenditure, perhaps scale, build out without a profit involved, but as an expenditure of money. And then as Keynes would say, that money would go into general circulation and there'd be a multiplier effect. Other jobs would be living off of the money created by the decarbonizing jobs in the first place. So in my novel, I present Mary Murphy beating people on the head for most of a decade to get the central banks to agree to do it. And the legislatures have to order the central banks to do it because that's the way these systems work. Legislatures or the Central Committee in China. After the book came out, I discovered there's a thing called the Network for Greening the Financial System. It already exists. You can go to the website. It's a somewhat, I mean, Mark Carney, when he was Chancellor of the Exchequer, thought there should be such a thing. And someone last week told me that the baby Carneys, the other central bank leaders who want to be as prominent as he's been by doing things just as good, that they've cooked up this network for greening the financial system. And they have a white paper out with 9 points as to how we can green finance from the central bank's point of view. 9 points, I retyped them out into my English to see if I could understand them. I could only type out 7 of them. 2 of them defeated me completely. And I think it might be down to a single word or 2 I didn't get. It's funny how translation works or doesn't work. But I wondered, are those 9 points the carbon coin already? Or would the carbon coin be a 10th point of particular power? I don't have the expertise to be able to judge that. But the point is, they were already working on it. I didn't know about it when I wrote my book. So I'm thinking that people know we're in desperate straits, and they know that you can't make a profit from dragging down billions of tons of CO2 from the atmosphere, and yet we have to do it anyway. It's like building a sewage system. People made their livings building the sewers that are underneath our big cities. You made a living from it, and probably the owner of the building company even made a profit from it. But the product is usually not something you make a profit from. So when you talk about scaling it, thinking, well, we don't need tons of shit, and maybe it makes good fertilizer. You don't need billions of tons of CO2. Maybe it can turn into concrete and steel replacements. Maybe it can be turned into other useful materials, because material science is doing an astonishing thing, and carbon and oxygen are not bad things to work with. On the other hand, billions of tons, no way. 95, 99% of that is just going to have to be injected in the ground or bonded with rock or gotten rid of. And so it doesn't make a profit, and yet it's a necessity. So there you have the carbon coin as us saving our ass by way of a deliberate technology, which is finance itself, software, this software of civilization. So, I mean, I could talk about the other more technical things. The only other one of interest, I think, is sucking water out from underneath the great glaciers of Antarctica and Greenland to slow them back down to their original speed. I love that. And turns out there's papers about that too that I didn't know about. I had one crazy glaciologist tell me that, and I said, why don't you publish? And he said, I don't want to be a geoengineer, you publish it. It's a science fiction idea. So I did, but there are papers in Nature that do the quantitative analysis, and it seems like the oil companies could be put to work. Maybe we could save sea level. I reckon that if the glaciers go, that we might be underwater here in 200 or 300 years or sooner. Everything's going faster. So that's a cool tech too, but I think it's the financial tech that really matters.
Interesting. But can I ask you a quick question about the other tech as well that you have? Is that social media is kind of, not nationalized, but internationalized, and it's it's taken out of the hands of private companies in the novel. Do you think that's an important thing that's relative to climate change, or is that just part of your kind of wider wishes for a more utopian society to take it out of those private hands?
It's more the latter. I don't know. This is a sign of my antiquity. I don't know if it matters if social media is a public good or in private hands, because it seems to me people can say what they want on it. Maybe you don't need to seize it. Advertising, blah, blah. I would reckon that maybe that's a chapter that I should never have mentioned the word blockchain. And I should never have mentioned the word social media. Perhaps it's just muddying the waters of what matters. But I don't know. I would say that this is a case of when you're juggling like 20 balls in the air, and they're not just balls, they're like chainsaws and flaming torches, and somebody throws in another ball. I think, oh yeah, I can juggle that too, but I should have just dodged it.
Oh, see, I agree with you there. That's one of my bugbears. So I just wanted to check how climate change relevant it was.
No, I'm sorry. It was one of those everything novels where you can't really tell what fits and what doesn't. And now, I think I missed a couple of important things, and then I added a couple of unimportant things.
Well, I'll ask you one more question, and then I'm going to open it to audience questions so everyone can kind of get ready. One more question on the point of the carbon coin is, see if you're compensating people for carbon that's kept in the ground. There are elements of like the eyewitness accounts that show that could be redistributive. Like there's people that are on like small farm holdings that are making a far better living than they ever have before because they're sequestering carbon, and that's actually like working really well for them. However, that would, I imagine, also involve paying a lot of money out to, say, oil companies or things like that. Do you think that so suppose what I'm saying is there's a practical element that you're saying that you need to compensate people for this carbon, but then does that not kind of grind your gears a bit that there's not a justice element to that people could be making loads of money that have been kind of part and parcel of destroying the environment, and you don't want to give reparations to those people that have been part of that, but do you have to overcome your spite in order to do what's best for everyone? I don't know.
Yes, this is a really good question, and I believe that my answers to it are regarded as a little bizarre and going beyond what people have said so far about the carbon coin. I think it's logical extension. If you keep carbon in the ground, you ought to be compensated, as well as if you draw it down out of the atmosphere and sequester it, which regenerative agriculture, that you could grow soil and make money from that too, or forests. And effectively, we need every possible method that has ever been proposed to draw carbon out of the atmosphere, because there isn't enough land. You can't do it by forest alone. You can't do it by kelp beds alone. You can't do it by soil alone. At a certain point, the carbon load maxes, and we need everything, including direct air capture, which is the machinery and the tons of useless CO2. If you keep it in the ground, shouldn't you also be compensated? And so here I have to say to the world, and I've been defending it, and now I think to the point where I think it's right. We lived off that oil, coal, and gas. We all did. Civilization did. The oil companies, until the moment where they started lying about the results when they knew, they were simply the fuel company that energized our welfare, our prosperity, especially in the developed West. And you could find individual culpable people probably who were executives who said, oh my God, this CO2 is going to be bad for the world. Let's pay think tanks like the Heartland Institute and other stupid organizations to put out disinformation so we can continue to burn carbon for a couple more generations just to maximize our profit before it all crashes. Well, some of those people should maybe be in jail, but the industries themselves and the people who are in good faith trying to make the transition are our industries. They our bodies, even the food, because fertilizer and the energy needed to run tractors are also carbon fuel based, it's not appropriate to think of them as criminals. I just saw some idealistic young woman shouting at the CEO of Royal Shell a couple days ago in Edinburgh. Great theater, but I'm thinking, okay, compensation, let's get to that. There is the concept of the haircut, and there is the concept of amortization. So they've got an asset, and 75% of the carbon that's fossil fuels that have been identified in the grounds are national assets. They're owned by countries, not by private companies. 75%. Those countries have already borrowed on that money. They've loaned out on that money. These are national resources as well as financial assets of countries that need to have their economies not crack. So, but we also know about the concept of the haircut. This comes out of finance, that, okay, I'll give you 20% of what your product is worth if it were actually to sell. But since it's now a stranded asset, for me to give you 20% is what you've got to deal with and get away with it and transition your industry into doing something useful, like sucking water out from under glaciers, for instance, or building clean energy. That's what your efforts of your company now have to be devoted to. And we're not going to cut you off or throw you in jail because it's a workforce too. And it's also, you don't want a Great Depression, which from a quick dropping of fossil fuels and or treating them as criminals when A, we've used them, B, they're necessary. I think compensation is in order and ought to be arranged as part of the carbon coin. But amortized, like, okay, you would have made $3 trillion over the next 100 years. It wouldn't be paid. So we're not giving you $3 trillion right now. Why should we? We'll amortize it over the 100 years and actually in a diminishing discount rate because it's useless stuff now. And you can transition off of it. And here I would defer to the economists who are noticeably lacking, who are absent when you need them most to make these calculations. Why I am, as a science fiction writer and an English major, am even talking about this stuff is a little absurd, but who else is talking about it? So you put a discount rate on it, you pay people to keep carbon in the ground, you keep those businesses alive, you transition them to something useful like clean energy. You make all these arrangements and you avoid a depression and you avoid a mass extinction event. So I think it is part of the carbon coin, and people who have reacted in shock, either moralistic shock or financial shock, like you can't let them get away with it, but it was us, or it will wreck everything financially. Well, play with the numbers, please, and make it work. So that's my answer to that.
That's really nice. I like moving beyond that point of critique. It's pleasantly utopian. Do we have any questions from the audience? I was thinking I might take two from you guys if anyone has one, and then I'll see if there's any online questions.
Yes.
So would you view your novel as a call to action? And what would you imagine your readers doing if it is a call to action?
I would imagine it as a call to action or even a blueprint of potential actions to take. So not just a call, but also a planning document. Well, how shocking for a novelist, you know, I would like it to also be a beautiful work of art, arts for art's sake, something like this cathedral in sentences, of course, but a call to action also. And then people, I mean, they've been mining this book for ideas. Could this work? Could that work? But it's a little too, it's not granular enough. It's probably best to call it a call for action. And then the actual actions you would have to work out in your own discipline and in your own detail and with your own financing. Yeah.
Yeah, Elaine.
You mentioned a couple of issues that now you would have liked to have in the book. Can you say a little bit about them?
Just to repeat for people at home, you've mentioned a few issues you would have liked to put in the book. Can you mention a couple of those?
I keep forgetting. Maybe that's why they aren't there. It's clear to me that we are going to need direct air capture, and it's maybe mentioned in the book, but given there's 106 chapters, there could be 107th where someone is building the machinery to suck CO2 out of the atmosphere and then bond it with rock. They're doing this in Iceland, they're doing it in Switzerland, in Zurich, in fact, working up the machines. And then there was something else that struck me as very apropos that now has slipped out again, but you know, the book's done, I can't add it anyway, so.
And do we have any online questions?
So would you consider naming dates to be the biggest challenge of writing climate science fiction, not in terms of accurately predicting the future, but in terms of being realistic?
Okay, so would you consider naming dates to be the biggest challenge for climate change fiction, not in terms of accuracy, but in terms of being realistic?
You mean dating things? Well, everything's going faster than the climatologists predicted in terms of climate change. So they set scenarios, the IPCC, they're being very meticulous, but they also want to say things that they can back up with data and modeling that has been really rigorously checked so that it can't be challenged as being tendentious or crying wolf. But in every prediction, it's going as fast or faster than the prediction said in the earlier IPCCs. And that's why this most recent IPCC from early August was like, it went from a hotel alarm in the middle of the night, which happened to be in Glasgow when I was here in 2005. Quite shocking. Everybody out on the streets in their PJs or semi-naked at 3 a.m. wondering what happened. It's a really loud noise. To almost an explosion in a cathedral, a great novel by Carpentier. This latest IPCC report is the explosion in the cathedral. We have change. We'll see what happens next week at the COP meeting here in this city as to whether the diplomats and representatives of their governments acknowledge what the scientists are now insisting on. So dates. In my book, it's completely wrong. There's a sentence in there, the 2030s were zombie years. I have to think, what was I thinking? And it was 2019 and the pandemic hadn't happened. There's no way that the 2030s are going to be zombie years. It was 2019 that was the zombie year. And then it was the pandemic slapping us in the face in March of 2020. And now everything in this, it's sort of like a Ken MacLeod sub-universe where everything that is talked about in this book as taking decades is actually going to take mere years, if not months, in the real world. So again, if you're doing near future science fiction, best to not put any dates on it at all. Let people adjust accordingly.
Were you one of these people that had hopes at the start of the pandemic that it might have been the start of change for the climate, you know, with air travel being reduced and the, you know, all these like memes about the dolphins returning to the Venetian canals and all this kind of thing? You know, did you think that that was the start of a turning point?
Well, I think it was. I still think it was. Now, I don't want to be utopian in the bad sense about that. There was a 6 or 7% reduction in carbon burn for the year 2020. As opposed to the year before. And I was shocked that it wasn't bigger. And people were explaining to me, the infrastructure runs on that stuff. So it wasn't just the consumer society of the advanced West. It was keeping the ships going, the trains going, the electricity in your house going. I still think we learned incredible lessons out of the pandemic that will translate into more vigorous and effective action in climate change. It won't be a 1-to-1 ratio. It won't be like the light bulb went off over everybody's head and they're suddenly all whatever you would call it, gigantic climate warriors. But things have been accelerated. Lessons have been learned. The fact that society can grind to a halt because of a invisible bug. I myself was deeply shocked by that. My wife, a chemist, was just laughing at my stupidity. How could it be? But we all learned a lesson from it. And I think they'll be applied going forward.
Absolutely. And was that all the online questions?
It seems like literary or other novelists are turning more to science fiction. The Does this give science fiction more credibility or just help keep it in the outhouse?
Okay, so when literary novelists turn to science fiction, they maybe get more credit for it. Is this bringing more kudos to science fiction, or is it leaving it in the outhouse because they're still defined as being literary, obviously?
Well, yeah. To my mind, there is a moment in 20th century culture that was the modernist moment. And that was very intent on having high literature and popular culture, mass culture. One of the definitions of modernism is they're the great modernist geniuses, and then there's pop culture, the comic books, the weekly movies, the crap that ordinary working people entertain themselves with, whereas the intelligentsia was reading their Joyce and Proust, etc. And indeed, those are beautiful works of art. Now, one of the signal measures of postmodernism is that dichotomy has collapsed in our culture. And in general, the culture, the young people, it's like, well, a graphic novel, why would you call that a comic book? Or why wouldn't you call it a comic book? It's as great as any other art form. Or graffiti, as good as this stuff. In other words, in postmodernism, that high-low split already collapsed, and that's one signature of postmodernism. But it's Raymond Williams who taught us that in any cultural moment, there's the residual and there's the emergent. And the two mix in an uneasy way in the present. So at our postmodern moment, and now of course we're in the Anthropocene, so you could say that the postmodern was like a brief little deflation explosion of the high modernist moment, and then the Anthropocene starting in 2001 or so is maybe a completely different thing, who knows? There's still residual modernists, often in the academy, often in publishing houses or in reviews. You see really smart reviews like the London Review of Books that carry a little of this residual attitude, but insecure or foolish reviews like the New York Review of Books carry a high charge of, as your island of residual high modernism is drowning in a flood of postmodern Anthropocene, climate change, science fictional culture, you get more and more defensive, more vehement, more intense about we are the real literature and we're drowning in the shit from these outhouses. Oh my God, how horrible. Well, from the point of view of a science fiction writer, going back into the time where it's clear that I still have a bit of a chip on my shoulder, it's melting like the glaciers. It's a very small chip compared to what it used to be when I would love to punch people out about this stuff. As it is, I feel like in a way that I've been saying this now for more than a decade, we are all living in a science fiction novel that we are co-authoring together. Science fiction is the realism of our time. If you want to play on your island of modernist superciliousness, more power to you. But we've got the literary moment by writing science fiction. And this is a personal case that I'm making here, and I don't want to burden you with it too much, but I think it's a plausible cultural history. I think it describes something real that's happened in my time. And it makes me happy. As a science fiction patriot, what you have to understand, this happened in Glasgow when I was here 25 years ago, and that crucial moment when I came, whenever that was. The science fiction community is like a small town. They all know each other. They all, like small towns, they know each other too well. There's gossip, there's knives in your back, but there's solidarity too, because you're a small town in a big world, and the science fiction community has been like that all along. Very kindly, warm, collegial space, eccentric. It's now nerd culture is a big thing because of this transition I'm describing. But when you were a nerd, when it wasn't cool to be a nerd, then you had to hang together. So it pleases me that the world has been conquered by this tiny little genre, by what? By the force of history, by technology, by all these things, that we were there first. We took care of each other. We had geniuses, Gene Wolfe, Joanna Russ. These were as good as anybody writing in their time. J.G. Ballard.
Oh. I'm so glad
that's Ballard. That's probably Ballard calling in saying I was never a science. No, he was a science fiction patriot himself. Brian Aldiss. I'm thinking of the Brits now. And in fact, the British science fiction community is as intellectually vigorous and astonishing beyond any other science fiction community. Why this island, God knows, it might have to do with the Industrial Revolution, studying it for some kind of, or just an intellectual tradition, a kind of esoteric, hyper-intellectual culture. The science fiction from Britain is astonishingly good, and you can't be matched by American science fiction, to tell you the truth. At least I say this as a reader. It's my own reading experience. So now here we are, and it's a kind of beautiful thing to see, and maybe it's part of the call to act. Maybe it's helpful too. I don't know.
I think I'm going to take the prerogative to ask the final question because we're running out of time, unfortunately. Can you tell me in less than 3 minutes, what would you hope that COP26 might achieve? And do you think it could be a turning point in our response to the climate crisis?
You know,
3 minutes or less.
Yeah, it's a technical question that I'm not competent to answer. I would hope that, I know that the people who care, who are organizing it here, are hoping to do something that would please the society of the spectacle, that something spectacular would come out of it. But all the diplomats have to go back home and fight with representatives of their own national government who will be doing their damnedest to undercut whatever's promised in COP26. So I would say that we're in the realm of symbols here, that the real work will be back home on an individual level. And so what you would hope for is something symbolic to come out of COP26 rather than something real. And that's just my feeling about it. Because it is a contested space that we're in historically. I mean, there are people who are looking for technical things. You know, will China promise more or will they promise less? Will India come on board? Will the Americans manage to pass their own national bills to the point where we can come with something, which is absolutely an open question right now? All this is up in the air, so it might have to be translated to the realm of symbols, that we met, that was post-pandemic, that we all, this is the crucial thing, all 178 nations have signed on, have gathered together. It has transcended the nation state system and become the nation state system has agreed to cooperate to deal with a global biosphere emergency. So even just showing up is maybe the crucial fact, and then we'll see what the results are. But the showing up here in Glasgow will in itself be a sign that we're taking it seriously, and that wasn't true earlier. So I wouldn't want to set the bar too low, but since I don't even understand the bar, I'm just going to say, let's meet and do what we can to get out of here with a good result.
Excellent. And I have to say that the novel is, as somebody who sometimes, I'll admit, turns away from like newspaper articles about the latest terrible thing that's happened. I can't bear to read it anymore. And I read this novel all the way through, and actually it's refreshing to read something that you actually want to read about this. And I think that that's testament to that like optimism that you've got and everything. And it really makes it a pleasure to confront this. And, you know, I never thought I would say that about the climate crisis, but there you go. So I'm just going to say a couple of things to wind everything up, guys. Thank you so much for coming. I'd like to remind everyone that you can visit the Dear Green Bothy's website and join us for future events, and that's at deargreenbothy.gla.ac.uk. And we'll also be in touch after the session via Eventbrite, I think, with a link to the full programme and an opportunity to share your feedback on tonight's event. So Kim Stanley Robinson is going to be signing books at the back of the hall in a second for those of you who are here in person. Thank you so much to those of you who joined us at home and for your questions. That was really good. And let's just finish by just saying thank you very much to Kim Stanley Robinson.
Thank you all for coming. It's a busy world, and to come out like this, I appreciate it very much. It's I love Glasgow. It's been a long series of visits that have meant a lot to me. So this will be added to that happy list in my heart. Thank you.
Thanks very much.